This is In Hindsight, half a century of research discoveries in Canadian history, presented by Dr. Donald B. Smith and produced by the Ontario Historical Society.
It's a great pleasure today to talk in episode 15 about a very good friend of mine, Hugh Dempsey. Hugh Dempsey has made an enormous contribution to historical studies in Alberta and Western Canada. And so, with great relish and enthusiasm, I begin this episode on my friend. The first time I heard Hugh speak, I can give you an exact date, was in June 1974 at the University of Toronto. I was still a graduate student, but I just received word a couple of weeks before that I had obtained an appointment at the University of Calgary and that I would be paid to do my hobby. That is, I'd be paid to teach Canadian history. Wonderful. So I was quite high. And it's still June. I would go west in August. But I went to the Canadian Historical Association. They had their annual meeting in Toronto, and I attended. There was a very interesting panel in what we call now Indigenous history. Then it would be called Native history. And I attended, and the panel, Hugh Dempsey was a member of the panel. And he was asked to speak about his book, Crowfoot, which had just come out 2 years before. Crowfoot is the story of this amazing Blackfoot or Siksika chief, was an orator, wonderful orator, diplomat, and a peacemaker. And, as well, the foremost spokesperson of the Blackfoot Confederacy at Treaty 7 for Southern Alberta. This man is major. So Hugh had done a biography, and my goodness, I'll tell you a little bit more about that biography later in the episode. But for the moment, I was blown away. Here was a gentleman who was speaking about Aboriginal topic, an Indigenous topic, from the inside. His work was based on an enormous amount of research, documentary, that's what I'm familiar with, but complemented by oral stories, evidence. It's extraordinary. It was full-blown. It was absolutely just a breath of fresh air. I was so inspired. And now delighted that I would be going to Calgary and could get to know Hugh Dempsey. And certainly I did once I arrived in August. And Hugh became a very close friend. He gave many guest lectures to my class, particularly in the early days when I was, what do we say, green as a cucumber. I didn't know the Western situation too well. My focus had been on Ontario and Central Canada, Ontario and Quebec, and here I am in Western Canada. Well, Hugh helped me enormously. Gave a number of guest lectures. He'd come, I can just see it in my mind. He would show up, always graciously accept, and his notes would come on an envelope. He'd have this speaking notes on just an envelope, and boy, would it be good. Students loved it. Well, Hugh helped me then with my knowledge of Western Canadian, well, not just Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous subjects. He'd already been the editor of Alberta History for years and would continue to do so, and I'll also return to that in a minute. Well, Hugh helped me then with my lectures. He helped me with Longlands, Chief Buffalo Child Longlands. Well, we talked about him in episode 4. Well, Hugh's the one that directed me to George Goodrum, a friend of his. George had been the Indian agent on the Blackfoot or Siksika Reserve in the 1920s, and he was very useful. And also Mike Eaglespeaker, who was a Blood or Kainai First Nations person who had known Longlands very well, also in the 1920s. Now, that really was terrific. But it wasn't just that. Hugh helped me with writing tips. And over the first number of years, I certainly, he gave me the best advice of all early in the game. That was, I was doing my texts without putting the footnotes in immediately. My idea was to come back and do the footnotes after I had the text. hard part was getting the text together, I thought. Well, he advised, listen, just put the footnotes in as you go, or just a rough sketch of them or something, because it's torturous if you don't do it right away. Well, that's true, and I've altered my system, and footnotes, rough guide to them went in on the manuscript, and that saved me a lot of hassle, a lot of troubles later. The other rule was that Hugh shared with me was what I call it, but Hugh didn't call it this. I call it the 95% rule, and that was Hugh. He was a seasoned gladiator to this point. He'd done a number of books and certainly a huge number of articles. Hugh said that when you get the time to write, the time to act is when you get about 95% of the information. And don't worry about the last 5% because that is so torturous. The job should be begun. So whenever you get near what this is just conversational, 95% of the information you can possibly ever anticipate getting, start writing. Good advice. Really, I owe a great deal to him for these writing tips. Well, let's step back a bit now. How did this gentleman, who you're going to be hearing about in the next few minutes in this accompaniment of the oral text, of course, is always supplemented by a written text. And in my episode notes here on the web, the text for this episode, I describe this in full detail. This is on the oral presentation will be abridged, but the full real deal quote will be in the written text, which accompanies episode 15. So what the greatest influence in Hugh's early life is very important because he's written his autobiography, Always an Adventure. It came out, some years back, maybe. And it's a gold mine. And from his autobiography, it's quite clear that the greatest influence on him as a young fellow, as a young boy, was his mother, who was a war bride. She was English, born in England, and married Hugh's father, a soldier, Canadian soldier. They came to Canada after World War I and farmed at a place called Edgerton, which is, not within the shooting range of Edmonton. And so they started in central Alberta farming. The tough life, really, really. And she was English. She was not used to this way of life. Eventually, after some years, actually, when Hugh was 5, Hugh was born in 1929. And after his birth, when he was about 5 at the time, the family moved into Edmonton and left the farm. Now, Hugh at school, he was good in certain subjects, the ones that he liked: English, social studies, and art. He was an honor student in those 3 disciplines. But the rest, he was sort of indifferent. Is that the best word? So Hugh didn't finish high school. It's extraordinary. This giant of Alberta history, of Canadian historical writing, only had grade 11. He left school in his the grade 12 year. He wanted to get out in the world and do things, and he searched around a bit. There were some false starts, but eventually he found it. He found his calling, and it came through. There's a venerable Alberta newspaper in Edmonton. Actually, the first newspaper in Edmonton was the Edmonton Bulletin. It was still functioning, and Hugh applied there, and he got taken on as a copy boy. Well, this guy was good. He was a natural writer, really, and had this enthusiasm and this eye for a story that he rose from copy boy to reporter and right up the ranks to provincial editor at age 21. Provincial editor at the Edmonton Bulletin. It's extraordinary. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is the Edmonton Bulletin folded. So he reaches the top, and then the paper folds, and he's got to look for another job. Well, at the Bulletin, though, he had several years there, and they were instructive, very good years. And, Hugh explained to me what he did learn that first little run with journalism. He learned the importance of the opening sentence. He also learned the value of being concise. And those 2 qualities of popular writing, he conveyed to me. So I'm a great beneficiary. After the Bulletin, Hugh got a job as a publicity writer for the Alberta government. and he was there for 3 or 4 years. And this was a government job, so it was enjoyable. Had sort of a little bit more what I wanted, but it was good, and he learned more writing skills and had an opportunity to publish quite a few things. Journalists, just articles, but anyways, he's on his way, and. Another development, when he's with the Alberta government, it was at the Bulletin, actually, just before the Bulletin folded, Hugh was asked to attend an Indian Association of Alberta meeting in Edmonton. And he really didn't have too much background on that topic at this point, Indigenous subjects, not at all. Well, sure lucky, though, he went to that meeting, because there he met the president's daughter, James Gladstone, a very attractive young woman, Pauline Gladstone, and well, that was wonderful. That was his turning point. My gosh. Well, Pauline and Hugh got on like a house on fire. Pauline was very popular with Hugh's parents, and Hugh was very popular with Pauline's, and in particular her father, who loved to talk about history. And her father, James Gladstone, was a Blackfoot speaker. He very competent. He's a farmer, a rancher, a very competent individual. Spoke excellent English, as well as he could speak the old Blackfoot, and he was interested in history, and he was very well integrated in the community, and very important in the Indian Association of Alberta. This was a wonderful contact. Now, what I like about Hugh is, his autobiography is really good, but there's also other snippets and other of his publications, of his background and whatnot. There's a wonderful quote that I think best enters here. Incidentally, Hugh and Pauline were married in 1953. After they just were so compatible, and still, for 2/3 of a century they were together. Hugh passed away, I should point out, last May. So, well, Hugh learned it just incredible. He learned so much. He was an insider now. He was part of the Gladstone family. And here's what he says, actually. He did a biography of his father-in-law in 1986. It's called The Gentle Persuader, and that's where this wonderful quote comes from. And I want to just share it with you. It is just so evocative. Here's Hugh, Gentle Persuader, page 141. Quote, I had become part of a close-knit extended family of brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, and people whose exact relationship was uncertain. That is a wonderful thing about Indian families. Bloodlines are less important than a mutual acceptance of someone as family. Well, through the Gladstone family, Hugh gained an entry into the First Nations world, one completely unknown to most non-Indigenous Albertans. Pauline noted of her husband, I noticed Hugh's mind was like a sponge. Not only were people willing to share their knowledge with him, but they were fascinated that someone was interested in hearing their stories and reminiscing with them. So yeah, he was on his way. On the route, though, there were many misunderstandings. In his own words, Hugh at first didn't know his way around. And there's a number of instances. His autobiography is full of them, and my text has several. But time presses, and I just have time really to give you one. It's Hugh learned, for example, that there's protocols, and even at a powwow, there were protocols for couples. For the owl dance at the powwow, there's certain rules. He didn't know this, of course. I wouldn't have known either. But the 3 rules were the following. Women asked the men to dance. The men could not refuse. And wives could not dance with their husbands. Well, there's all kinds of other factors as well, and there's an etiquette, and Hugh learning this in spades. It's just wonderful. Well, let's say what's the best word, in a bureaucratic way, he learned something as well. Hugh learned firsthand, after he married Pauline, how the Canadian government had divided many First Nations families. Their wedding had led them into the complications of the Federal Indian Act. When my wife married me, Hugh said in a 1961 interview, she legally became no longer an Indian. At the same time, her brother married a white girl, and the girl legally became an Indian. This gives us a situation where my wife, who was raised on the Blood Reserve and speaks the language fluently, is not an Indian. But her sister-in-law, who was raised in a white community and does not speak the language, is legally an Indian. This is extraordinary, isn't it? The Indian Act, by the way, was only altered in 1985 to correct this injustice. Well, Hugh, they had Hugh and Pauline, just a wonderful, sensational marriage. They had 5 children, and they were really busy. Oh, understandably, 5 children. And he's got a big job because, I should tell you, he had got a new position, and he left the government of Alberta when a new position came up as archivist at the newly established Glenbow Foundation. And Hugh moved with Pauline. They moved to Calgary around 1955, and Hugh began his work. And he would begin as an archivist and then go right up to the top, right up to curator, then and director of the Glenbow Foundation, a huge institution in Calgary. But he starts as an archivist and collected all kinds of wonderful things for future historians of Alberta: photos, manuscripts, just cornucopia of goodness. So he's busy then at the Glenbow, and Pauline, the 5 children eventually at home, but one rule: family comes first. Hugh would do his writing on vacation, and not in family time. Just extraordinary. What a balanced position. Well, when he was with the Glenbow Foundation, I should point out, good story. Can't leave out a good story. I had an old First Nations friend who told me that it's important when you're writing to put raisins in the dough. Put some anecdotes in. Live it up. That's what I'll do, because I can't leave this one alone. Hugh did think of enrolling at the University of Alberta and doing a degree. And this is fun. This was actually just before he moved from Edmonton. The possibility was there that he might just go to the University of Alberta and to get a degree, and all seems good. He'd already begun a correspondence with Jack Ewers, who was the ethnologist at the Smithsonian. Imagine this, a young man in his early 20s who was so enthusiastic about Indigenous topics, he began a conversation with one of the world's great experts at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. His name was Jack Ewers. And Jack, they had a terrific correspondence. Jack, what a good guy. He's a senior academic, and he's corresponding with this young chap. And Hugh shares with him that he was thinking of doing this, getting his BA at University of Alberta. But Jack advised him against it. Don't quit your government job. The respected Great Plains scholar wrote his young friend, quote, "I believe that you are now much better qualified to make something out of anthropology than the average person entering college with a yen to become an anthropologist. Your published work would show that." Wow, what an endorsement. Well, he's got a great sense of humor. This is what he says in the autobiography. In any case, as Hugh points out in his autobiography, he never had to decide about his best course of action. It all became academic when the University of Alberta indicated it had no desire to accept a high school dropout into its ranks. I just love that line. Well, now, Glenbow. Now, the Glenbow was a great time because they supported him. They encouraged him to do interviews in the communities, and this is good public relations. Also, it led to good connections and what have you. And so they encouraged him with his writing. And, Hugh's father-in-law is a perfect person. Hugh's interest was in the Blackfoot Confederacy, other interests too, but primarily in the Indigenous field. It was the Blackfoot. And there are 3 nations, I should point out. There's the Blackfoot or Siksika. There's the Piikani, and then there is the Bloods or Kainai, and Pauline was a Kainai blood, and so that's the main group of the Confederacy that he's interested in. Well, what he decided to, and we started with this talk I heard in 1974. He started almost 20 years before, to begin assembling notes for his biography of Crowfoot. Crowfoot is the book that he talked about in Toronto in June of 1974. It just come out 2 years earlier, and it's a terrific book. He did the manuscript. Jack Ewers encouraged him, and he finished it. That's the good news. Bad news, couldn't get a publisher. He sent it off to publishers, in those days, mainly in Toronto, and back it came. Advice: cut it by 2/3. Make it a children's book. Oh, how insulting. Well, Hugh put it back in the drawer, and there it would stay for over a decade. Just unbelievable. The indifference and the ignorance of Indigenous subjects. Well, who published it? University of Oklahoma Press in 1972. I see the influence of Jack Ewers there. He tipped them off. And the University of Oklahoma Press, very distinguished press for Indigenous topics, they brought it out in 1972. And then the wonderful publisher in Edmonton, Hertig, just starting out, they bought the rights for Canada, and the book was in circulation 1972 on. 2 years later, I heard Hugh speak about it at University of Toronto at the Canadian Historical Association. So that was it. That broke the logjam. He's on his way. We have now an established writer. And every year, almost every year, after 1972, he would publish a book on an Indigenous or non-Indigenous subject. A special interest of his deserves a tip of the hat, and that was in Bob Edwards. Hugh is doing more than none in Indigenous history. He also does non-Indigenous history, and a particular topic that he loved was Bob Edwards, who was a very controversial editor who wrote a newspaper, the most popular newspaper in Alberta in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century. The most popular was Bob Edwards' The Eye Opener. And he wrote 2 books on Bob Edwards. He loved his humor, and it was real social satire. Edwards' books, they're for the non-Indigenous side. These are the best. It's the best entry point, really, for Calgary in the early 20th century to look at the eye opener. Other books followed. Now, this mainly on the Indigenous side, almost really. Well, I'd say. Well, I don't want to put a percentage to it, but most are Indigenous books that come forward. The 2 Bob Edwards books and other topics, but particularly Indigenous. The 1978 one is a real barn burner. It's called Charcoal's World, and Charcoal's World is an extraordinary story of a Blood Indian who was caught in a cultural situation, a horrible cultural situation. And Hugh this book of his, it's his second major book. Crowfoot's the first, Charcoal's World is the second, and it really has popular interest. I'll give you a brief synopsis, but honestly, unfortunately, the text, please, after this audio, go to the text. It's much more full-bodied than one can do in a really an interview, which is what these audios are. Well, anyways, Charcoal's World focuses on a Kainai holy man who shot and killed his wife's lover in 1896 and became a fugitive. Charcoal had found them in the act of adultery. As Hugh wrote, quote, "The white men who ruled their lives said it was wrong to do these things. The police had the guns, they had the rope, they had the power. Even to kill a fornicator who had broken the written rules of the tribe was now wrong. The Indian laws meant nothing. Only the white man's laws counted. When he had violated these, Charcoal knew he would soon die." And then Hugh gets into this whole, the First Nation side of things, into the spirit world. And Charcoal resolved to kill an important person whose spirit would announce his coming to prepare them in the spirit world for his arrival. For months, Charcoal eluded police patrols, thwarting attempts to entrap him. He did kill one of his pursuers, and that was the end of it. He killed a Mountie, and now he is a most wanted individual. Just understatement of the year. And they're out to find him. And they do. And Charcoal, he's captured and executed. So it'd be a great intercultural story. More books follow. Red Crow, that's, well, if you want to give those categories, this would be the third big one. Red Crow is a study of a very important blood or Kainai chief, and who was a signatory of Treaty 7. And really, he was more of a soldier than Crowfoot. He was more of a military man, but it's a great book. After Big Bear comes Gentle Persuader, his biography of his father-in-law, James Gladstone. We're moving along here. History of Calgary, 1994. All the way along, he's helping others. I mean, honestly, family, job, and helping others. And I know that intimately because how he helped me. I was writing on the Steinhauer family. And this is a chapter in my book, Mississauga Portraits, which came out 2013. I have a chapter on the Steinhauers, particularly on Robert and Edgerton, who were college educated. Robert was college educated, and Edgerton had high school. Very phenomenal backgrounds for First Nations people from Alberta in the late 19th century. Most extraordinary individuals. Well, what Hugh gave me, and this is just, I have to, my good luck. I got an intimate view of Robert and Edgerton, the two sons of a famous Indian missionary, Henry B. Steinhauer. These are his two sons, Robert and Edgerton. And from Hugh, I got this wonderful text. It was in 1956. Here he is, young guy, mid-20s, at a meeting of the Historical Society of Alberta, and he took notes and typed them up on what Ralph Steinhauer said about his two uncles. Ralph's uncles were Robert and Edgerton. And Hugh took these, he's a consummate researcher and recorder, wonderful notes, which I was able to take what Ralph, who became Lieutenant Governor of Alberta in the mid-1970s, Ralph's memories of his two uncles, and they show the inner side of these chaps. And they became Christian ministers, both of them, but they're very, very proud First Nations individuals. It's extraordinarily rich. Well, how did I get that? Through Hugh, to his kindness. That's just one example. Others could provide a multitude of others. Just sharing. All culture is sharing, as is often said in the Indigenous world. So he helped others enormously. Okay, now, getting near the end. More books coming. The Great Blackfoot Treaties. Oh, this is an important book about a Cree. He did Big Bear, and then another one on a Cree leader, Masbatoon, that came out early 21st century. And also, but the big one is the Blackfoot Treaties. And the Blackfoot Treaties book came out in 2016. My goodness, it's just, less than a decade ago. It's a very, very important work on a subject which he's focused on for, all his life, really, the Blackfoot Treaties, ever since he became interested in Indigenous topics. Now, time for an overview. Well, very, very revealing quote. This is my good friend, George Melnick, who's the author of The Literary History of Alberta, 2 volumes. He interviewed Hugh in 1995 and asked him about his view of history and all, and Hugh replied, he saw himself as a writer who has entered the field of history. I tried not to be an academic writer. When you write something, you should try to communicate to your audience, whoever that audience happens to be. There's his goal. Wonderful quote in George Melnick's Literary History of Alberta. It says so much for this dedicated Albertan's commitment to his province's history that he edited the magazine that originated as the Alberta Historical Review, later becoming Alberta History, for 63 years. Let me repeat that. Guinness Book of World Records. Are you listening? Editor of an academic journal for 2/3 of a century. His remarkable tenure as editor only ended at age 91 with his retirement after the publication of the autumn 2020 issue. Hugh Dempsey added so much to our understanding of Alberta's heritage as a researcher, editor, writer, and archivist. He has rescued many aspects of our history by collecting historical manuscripts and photos and by recording the oral memories of the oral memories of First Nations people and non-Indigenous Albertans. He has written 22, that's by my count, full-length books, and edited another 17. What a career. What a contribution to Albertans' knowledge of their past. The Dean of Alberta Historians passed away in May 2022. Thank you.